Standard 2 covers learning objectives. We call them learning outcomes here at PCC, but they're really the same thing. And Standard 2 is a really important standard in quality matters because of the concept of alignment. Alignment, as I talked about a little bit in the overview video, really means that the course level learning outcomes are clearly stated and measurable, that the unit level learning outcomes support the course level learning outcomes, that the assessments measure the things that are stated in the learning outcomes, the learning materials support learning the learning outcomes, and the learning activities also support the mastery of learning outcomes. So good learning outcomes are really the foundation of the course, and if the learning outcomes are well chosen and well written, then the rest of the instructional materials will fall in line. If the learning outcomes are not well written, then it's going to cause a lot of difficulty later on when you're trying to design assessments and learning materials and learning activities to support those learning outcomes. So let's look at this in detail. So learning outcomes for the course must be measurable and clearly stated. Measurable has to do with, can you actually see somebody do something, right? Can I have the student demonstrate some behavior that I can observe in order to assess that that student has mastered the outcome? So this works well for outcomes like on completion of the course, the student will be able to overhaul a transmission. Does not work so well for outcomes like on completion of the course. Student will find an appreciation for basket weaving in their daily lives. You can't look at somebody and tell whether they're appreciating basket weaving in their daily lives or not. You can tell whether they can weave a basket because you can ask them to weave a basket and you can observe them while they do it, but you can't see inside their head. So learning outcomes that are like the student will understand something, those are really tricky because they're not observable directly. You can have the student perform actions that you can observe that indicate that the student understands the course material, but you can't observe understanding directly. So that's really what they're talking about when they say that the learning outcome should be measurable. Talking in terms of verbs that are objectively observable or observable by the instructor as part of their assessment. So this includes both course level learning outcomes and module level learning outcomes. So the overall outcomes for the course, as well as the outcomes that you have for each module that supports learning those course level learning outcomes. Module level learning outcomes should support the course level learning outcomes. So for example, if you have 6 course level learning outcomes, you should address each of those learning outcomes somewhere in your module level learning outcomes. If you miss 1 or 2 of them, well, your module level learning outcomes aren't really supporting all of your course level learning outcomes. Similarly, if you have a lot of module level learning outcomes that really don't tie back to the course level learning outcomes, your students might be learning interesting things, but they're spending a fair amount of time learning stuff that's outside of the course level learning outcomes, what you're supposed to be teaching. So that's what we mean by supporting the course level learning outcomes with the module level learning outcomes. All learning outcomes should be stated from the student's perspective. So that's basically saying that on completion of the course, the student will be able to do something, or will be able to apply some knowledge, or will be able to analyze some situation, and so on. What will the student be able to do or to demonstrate? That's what we mean by from the student's perspective. Appropriate for the level of the course means that you wouldn't have, for example, a student in an algebra course and then require them to be able to solve an integral. Similarly, you wouldn't want to have a course on Calculus 3 and have the learning outcomes be students will be able to set up algebraic equations or, figure out the slope of a line. It should be appropriate for the level of the course. Now, in addition, by level of the course, we actually are talking about difference in level of intellectual behavior. There's something called Bloom's taxonomy, and so I'm going to look that up on Google. Bloom's taxonomy. And there are a couple of different versions of Bloom's taxonomy, but Here's a picture. So these are different levels of intellectual behavior. So at the bottom, you have easiest in some sense. So knowledge, knowing things, discovering things, observing things, and so on, locating, naming. These are knowledge-based tasks, and the student learns the knowledge and can repeat the knowledge. Understanding or comprehension is higher up. So, for example, I can know that there's a logical construct in programming called iteration, but I might not understand that knowledge. And even if I do understand that knowledge, I might not be able to apply it to write an actual piece of code. So comprehension builds on knowledge, application builds on comprehension or understanding. Can you apply the knowledge that you've learned? So in an introductory class, for example, an appropriate level of intellectual behavior might be knowledge, just teaching the rudiments of jargon and the basic concepts in the class. Whereas asking the student to jump all the way up to a creation task, it's like, I've taught you that Baroque music exists as a thing and that it had a particular period. Now I'm going to ask you to write a piece of Baroque music all the way at the top. That's inappropriate. On the other hand, if you're talking about a fairly advanced level class, where it's reasonable to assume that the student will be able to create new work or have a cogent evaluation of the concepts in the field, asking them just to answer simple questions about, well, what does this term mean? What does this term mean? Without any kind of analysis or creativity, that's not at the right level either. So that's really what we mean by appropriate for the level of the course. Instructions to students on how to meet those outcomes should be adequately and clearly stated. So generally, you're talking about a set of learning activities and telling the student the learning activities they need to complete in order to attain mastery of the learning outcomes. And this can include things like discussion groups, it can include written assignments, it can include reading materials, watching videos, basically whatever learning activities and assessments that you have that support a mastery of those learning outcomes, you should state that to the student so that the student can go in and understand what they need to do to be successful.